Harold Whitaker stood by the window, his reflection faint in the glass. Behind him, the city stretched out, alive with lights. But in here, it was only stillness. No ringing phones, no voices. Just the steady hum of a clock that no longer mattered. He touched the edge of the table, the same one where he had fought for deals, where his name had been spoken with respect. Now, that name carried something else. Whispers, pity, disbelief. The man who had everything. The man who let it all slip away. He thought of the headlines, the CEO who paid for a dream, the wife who took it all. And somewhere between those words lay his truth. Not in the money lost, but in the trust betrayed. The silence pressed harder. It wasn't just the silence of a company that no longer belonged to him. It was the silence of a home emptied overnight. The silence of a promise broken without a sound. For a long moment, Harold closed his eyes. He didn't search for answers. He didn't search for blame. He simply let the weight of it settle, like dust on a forgotten shelf. And then, gently, almost reluctantly, his mind drifted backward. Not to boardrooms or numbers, not to wealth or power, but to the moment when it all began. The night he first saw her. The night curiosity took root, and everything that followed grew from it. Before the silence, there was noise. The kind of noise that follows power. Harold Whitaker, at 62, was the man every paper wrote about. His company stretched across states, his influence reached into homes he'd never stepped foot in. From the corner office on the top floor, the world seemed steady, secure. The board trusted his judgment. Investors leaned on his word. His name alone could raise the value of a room. And yet, behind that polished image, there was a man who rarely paused to breathe. In the mornings, he moved through rituals. Black coffee, tailored suit, a measured nod to the driver who carried him into the city. Each detail of his life precise, efficient, unyielding. Success had become his language. Discipline, his heartbeat. But when the day ended and the doors shut behind him, something else lingered. He'd sit in the dim light of his study, the television flickering in the background, a glass of bourbon half finished at his side. And he would ask himself a question no one else heard. Is this it? The empire was solid, the numbers strong, yet the man behind it all carried a quiet vacancy. The kind that success could never fill. He thought of the family dinners he had missed, the friendships thinned by time, the holidays spent staring at spreadsheets while snow gathered outside his window. People called him fortunate, some envied him. But Harold knew fortune is not the same as fullness. On the surface he had everything, but beneath it, he carried a hunger no one saw. And it was in that hollow space, unspoken, unanswered, that she would arrive. It was a gala in the city. One of those evenings, filled with crystal glasses, polite laughter, and conversations that rarely touched the truth. Harold Whitaker had attended countless nights like this. Handshakes, promises, empty words wrapped in charm. But that night was different. He noticed her before she noticed him. Celeste Monroe, 30 years old, though her presence carried more than youth. She had a way of standing still in a room full of motion. Her auburn hair caught the light, her green eyes held curiosity rather than calculation. And when she laughed, it wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was simply alive. She wasn't from his world. Not yet. She spoke of art, of travel, of the future she wanted to shape. Dreams, not margins. Visions, not quarterly gains. And for a man who had built his life on numbers, her words felt like air after years of breathing dust. When their conversation lingered longer than the others, Harold felt something stir. Not excitement, but recognition. She looked at him, not at the company, not at the fortune, but at the man. At least that's what he believed. The board would later whisper that she was ambitious. Friends would call her reckless youth. But in that moment, under the glow of chandeliers and the soft hum of a string quartet, Harold saw only possibility. Celeste spoke of opening doors, of chasing life before it slipped away. He listened, silent, drawn in. It had been years since someone had asked him not about strategy, but about him. By the time the evening closed, something had shifted. He left the gala with her voice echoing in his thoughts. And for the first time in decades, Harold Whitaker did not think of his empire. He thought of her. The wedding was not quiet. It could not have been. Society pages lit up with photographs. Harold Whitaker, 62, standing beside Celeste Monroe, 30. The headlines wrote themselves. Power and beauty. Love across time. A fortune's second act. Some guests applauded. Some whispered. Many judged. But the man at the center of it all did not hear them. Harold looked at Celeste with a certainty that left no room for doubt. He believed in what he saw, a partner, a new beginning, a reason to step outside the walls he had built around his life. The ceremony itself was elegant, restrained. White roses lined the aisle. A string quartet carried notes into the air. When she walked toward him, all grace and quiet confidence, Harold felt the weight of decades lift. For once, he was not the CEO. He was simply a man, saying yes to hope. But hope is rarely shared equally. In the photographs, Celeste's smile gleamed brighter than the lights. She held his hand, leaned into his shoulder, but her eyes sometimes drifted to the cameras, to the audience, to the attention that swirled around her like a crown. Where Harold saw love, Celeste felt something else. Arrival. After the vows, after the applause, they returned to a house too large for two. Harold walked the halls with quiet pride, convinced he had brought warmth into them at last. Celeste explored them with a different gaze, measuring space, noting value, letting her imagination stretch beyond the rooms themselves. It was the marriage everyone talked about. The one that drew smiles in public, doubts in private. And through it all, Harold never wavered. He told himself he had found not just love, but purpose again. He did not yet see the cracks, but the cracks were already there. Not long after the wedding, Harold crossed paths with someone from a quieter chapter of his past. Eleanor Grant. She was 58 now, her hair touched with silver, her eyes lined by years of teaching, of giving more than she had to spare. Once, long ago, she had been a colleague on a community board, the kind of work Harold supported but never lingered on. Now she returned with a story that stirred something deep inside him. Eleanor spoke not of wealth or success, but of children. Children who had never seen a canvas, never held a brush, never been told their voices mattered. She dreamed of building a cultural foundation, a place where art and music would not just decorate walls, but open doors. Harold listened, at first politely, then with growing stillness. The way she spoke reminded him of something he had lost, that hunger to build, not for gain, but for meaning. When Eleanor laid her sketchbook on the table, pages filled with plans drawn in careful strokes, Harold saw more than drawings. He saw legacy. Not the kind stock markets remembered, but the kind that lived in hearts long after the numbers faded. He offered to help. Quietly, discreetly, he began to fund her vision. Millions redirected from profit margins into something softer, something human. Celeste heard of it, and her face tightened. She did not see the gift, only the gap. Money leaving their accounts, money not poured into travel, into jewels, into the life she had imagined. But Harold brushed aside her protests. To him, Eleanor's dream was not charity. It was redemption, a way to give before time took away the chance. He thought love alone could carry both women in his life. One as wife, one as cause. He did not yet see that their worlds were colliding, and in that collision, everything would begin to unravel. At first, Celeste Monroe hid her unease behind careful smiles. She praised Harold Whitaker in public, spoke of his generosity as though it were her own. But at night, when the house quieted, her questions sharpened. Why her? She asked once, her voice low but edged. Harold looked up from Eleanor's proposals, surprised. It isn't about her. It's about the children. It's about the future. But Celeste did not hear future in his tone. She heard absence. A part of Harold she could not touch, no matter how close she stood. Each dollar he poured into Eleanor's dream felt to Celeste like a thread pulled from her own. The more Harold invested, the more Celeste withdrew. The laughter at dinners grew thin. The warmth in her eyes cooled. She wanted the life she had imagined when she said yes. Travel, luxury, applause. Instead, she saw her husband giving himself to something she did not believe in. That was when Victor Hale entered the picture. A friend of a friend, a lawyer with charm polished to glass. He listened to Celeste's frustration with patience that Harold no longer offered. He spoke softly of options, of the ways trust could be rewritten, of how power could shift quietly without a single headline. Celeste didn't agree at first. She played the part of the supportive wife, the smile beside Harold at galas, the gentle hand on his arm during speeches. But behind the polished surface, a different story began to form. She told herself she deserved more, that Eleanor was stealing what belonged to her, that Harold, blinded by sentiment, was giving away not just money, but her future. And with Victor's guidance, she began to imagine what life might look like, without Harold holding the pen. Natalie Pierce had been at Harold's side for 15 years. As COO, she had memorized the rhythms of his business, the quiet signs of risk most overlooked. She had seen markets rise and collapse, contracts fail and recover. But what she saw now unsettled her more than any financial storm. She noticed accounts shifting. Small at first, transfers labeled as routine, approvals slipped in under Harold's distracted hand. She noticed signatures that didn't look like his, though technically they were his. She noticed Celeste's growing presence in decisions she should never have touched. One evening, after a board meeting, Natalie lingered. "Harold," she said carefully, "I think you should review what's being signed. There are changes you might not realize." He looked tired, older than she remembered. "Natalie, I trust her," She's my wife. Wives can love, Natalie answered softly. They can also leave. The words landed, but Harold shook them off. He believed loyalty could not be divided. He believed trust was strength, not weakness. And so, he pushed Natalie's concerns aside. But Natalie kept watching. She watched as Celeste charmed the board, as Victor Hale appeared more often at dinners disguised as casual guests, as Harold's gaze drifted toward Eleanor's foundation while his empire shifted beneath him. Natalie knew the cost of silence. She had seen it bury leaders greater than Harold. And so, she resolved to speak again, even if it meant standing alone. For she understood something Harold did not. The cracks were no longer forming. They were widening. It began with papers. Papers Harold Whitaker did not read as carefully as he once had. Celeste Monroe placed them in front of him at breakfast, smiling as though it were nothing. Just routine updates, she said, pouring his coffee. He signed without question. He trusted her hand more than his own eyes. Victor Hale watched quietly from the background, a lawyer's smirk hidden beneath courtesy. Each document nudged ownership, shifted rights, redefined the future in words Harold no longer slowed down to see. At galas, Celeste tightened her hold on Harold's arm, whispered promises of travel, of quiet retreats when all this work was finished. He believed her. He wanted to. And while he dreamed of stepping back, she was already stepping forward. Natalie Pierce saw the pattern but could not stop it. She intercepted files, compared signatures, raised questions. Each time Harold dismissed her, insisting, "Celeste wouldn't betray me." His faith blinded him more than any contract. Meanwhile, Eleanor Grant's foundation grew. Children filled rooms with color, laughter, and sound. Harold stood in those halls with pride, convinced his fortune was finally shaping something eternal. But behind the walls of his company, another kind of construction was underway. Celeste and Victor were building a future too. One not of art and children, but of control. Every signature Harold gave away became a brick in her fortress. Every document signed in trust was a door closing behind him. And by the time he noticed the walls, he would already be outside them. The morning it broke open was unremarkable at first. Harold woke early, the same way he always had. The coffee steamed. The city stretched awake beyond his window. But when he opened the reports, silence pressed harder than before. Accounts were empty. Properties shifted. Shares transferred. The empire he had built with decades of sacrifice no longer answered to his name. He searched for Celeste, but she was gone. The closet half empty, the scent of her perfume lingering like a memory already fading. On the desk, one note, unsigned, unfinished, as though even goodbye was too much effort. Victor Hale's name appeared in the files, threaded through contracts Harold barely remembered touching. It was all legal, perfectly executed. A betrayal not of violence but of ink. The board convened within hours. Some looked at him with pity, others with quiet satisfaction. Words like careless, distracted, and unfit circled the room. Harold's name, once a shield, had become a stain. For the first time in his life, Harold Whitaker had nothing to lean on. No company, no fortune, no wife beside him at the table. Only silence, thick and absolute. And in that silence, the truth settled with finality. It wasn't his enemies who destroyed him. It was the hand he had held closest. When the noise of lawyers and boardrooms finally faded, Harold Whitaker found himself in places he had long ignored. Empty streets in the early morning, park benches where strangers sat with nothing to prove. He walked without a destination, stripped of title, stripped of certainty. And then, one afternoon, he heard laughter. Children's laughter. Sharp, unpolished, free. It drew him into a building he had nearly forgotten. Eleanor Grant's foundation. The walls, once bare, now bloomed with color. Paintings, scribbles, murals alive with untamed imagination. The kind of art no critic judged, because it wasn't made to be judged. It was made to be felt. Eleanor greeted him with quiet kindness, as if nothing had happened. No pity, no questions, just a chair and the invitation to sit. "Money can vanish," she told him softly, watching children press their palms against wet paint. "But what we give from the heart doesn't disappear." Her words did not erase the betrayal. They did not soften the loss. But they placed a light in a room that had been dark for too long. Harold stayed longer than he planned. He watched children who had little find joy in colors. He watched teachers guide hands with patience he had never known in his own career. And he felt something stir. Not power, not pride, but presence. For the first time in months, Harold wasn't looking back at what he'd lost. He was looking forward, if only by inches, at what still remained. And in that forward glance, the silence felt less heavy. Harold Whitaker had once been a man defined by his chair at the head of the table, by the sound of his name spoken in meetings, by the weight of his signature on a page. Now, there was no chair, no meetings, No signatures, only him. He moved through his days differently, slower, sometimes sitting by the window with coffee that cooled before he finished it, sometimes walking through Eleanor's foundation, watching as each new child found a voice in paint, in clay, in song. Natalie Pierce remained near, though the company no longer called her ours. She checked in, firm but gentle, reminding him that dignity was not lost, even if the empire was gone. "You're still Harold Whitaker," she said once. That has to mean something beyond numbers. It unsettled him, that thought. For decades he had believed his worth was inseparable from what he built. Now, stripped of it, he faced the question he had long avoided. Who was he without the throne? The nights were hardest. In the stillness, Celeste's absence ached sharper than her presence ever had. He thought of her eyes at the gala, bright and curious, and wondered if that moment had ever been real. Yet as the days stretched on, Harold began to find a different rhythm. Not the relentless march of ambition, but the slow, steady pace of simply being. He began to see himself not as a man undone, but as a man unmasked. And in that unmasking, he found the faintest outline of peace. The years of noise were gone. What remained was quiet. Harold Whitaker stood once more inside Eleanor Grant's foundation. The walls glowed with murals, layer upon layer of color from hands that once trembled with doubt. Children laughed, their voices carrying into corners where silence once lingered. He walked slowly, pausing at a canvas splashed with red and blue. A boy of 10 explained it proudly, pointing at shapes that looked nothing like the world, yet somehow carried all of it. Harold smiled, not because he understood, but because the boy believed he could. In that moment, he realized his name on skyscrapers had never felt this alive. The buildings had carried his wealth, but these walls carried his heart. Natalie stood at his side, no longer COO, no longer shield, just a friend who had stayed. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Harold's silence was no longer heavy. It was full. He thought of Celeste only briefly, not with anger, not with longing, but as one might recall a storm already past. The betrayal had taken his fortune, but not his capacity to give. That part, no one could take. Outside, the city moved on without him. The markets rose and fell, names shifted on office doors. But in this small place, Harold had left something lasting. Not power, not wealth, but presence. A legacy not written in contracts but in color, in laughter, in hands that dared to create. He was no longer a CEO, he was simply Harold Whitaker. And at last, that was enough. And so in the end, Harold Whitaker learned what few ever do, that wealth can vanish, power can fade, and trust can be broken. But the quiet act of giving endures. His empire was taken, his title erased, yet in the laughter of children, he discovered a legacy no betrayal could steal. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. What moment in Harold Whitaker's journey moved you the most? And if you were listening closely, you might notice how often Harold Whitaker's name came up. Drop your answer in the comments. We may feature your name in a shout-out as a thank you for being part of our Fiction Echoes family. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this one, the next chapter is already waiting. Just click the video that's about to appear, and we'll see you there. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a moment of what happens next.